Welcome to Clarity in a Messy World, the podcast that looks at the causes behind the most confounding issues of our time. I'm David Wayne Callahan. In every episode, I'll be speaking with experts who will share their knowledge and insights and help us to untangle a seemingly chaotic world. Clarity in a Messy World is a production of Bocconi University Milan in collaboration with the Bocconi Student Media Center. When you think about annual reports, you probably think about the usual figures: revenues, investments, market share. But new values are becoming just as important, those that revolve around sustainability. As companies strive to be more transparent, their reports are following suit. But is all that glitters gold? Or, in this case, green? Joining us today is Professor Ariela Caglio. Ariela is Associate Professor of Management Accounting at Bocconi and Director of the Bocconi ESSEC Double Degree. Since 2019, she's been a member of the Management Committee of the European Accounting Association. She's advisor to the United Nations for an ongoing project that's developing a common set of core universal indicators for corporate sustainability reporting aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Focusing on sustainability and integrated reporting since 2015, Ariela has recently been awarded 2 grants, one from the Institute of Management Accountants Research Foundation and another from the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, to study the intersection between CSR, sustainability reporting, performance measurement, and digital transformation. Ariela, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, David.
Ariela, you are a scholar of accounting and you study corporate social responsibility, or CSR. For those unfamiliar with CSR, it's a management concept whereby companies integrate social and environmental concerns into their business operations and interactions with stakeholders. It's generally understood as being a way for a company to achieve a balance between economic, environmental, and social imperatives, while simultaneously addressing the expectations of shareholders and stakeholders. Now, while CSR is inherently a good thing, it has really come into vogue in the past few years. It's even a regular feature in advertising. But how can it be associated with accounting?
That's a great question to start with, David, especially because it gives me the opportunity to say, don't you know that accountants will save the world?
Happy to hear it, so I'm happy to know you.
I understand that superhero is not a status usually associated with the accounting profession, but let me explain what I mean by this provocation. I believe that if we want to really and effectively address our main environmental and social challenges, businesses should be required to be transparent and to communicate how the natural resources they exploit or conserve and the social benefits they produce or neglect are factored into their value creation processes, day-to-day operations, and interactions with stakeholders. Transparency means accountability, and transparency is the basis of responsibility. Without transparency, companies cannot be made accountable of whether they're building or destroying natural and social capitals. And that's where accounting comes in. We, accounting scholars, refer to this as the real effects hypothesis, which states that the measurement and accounting rules have an impact on companies' behaviors. And you can also think about the common saying, what gets measured gets done, what gets measured gets managed. And in this sense, measuring, so accounting can promote CSR and behavioral change. And in this sense, accountants can save the world because they have a fundamental role in ensuring that firms assess and transparently disclose their CSR or environmental, social, and governance activities and initiatives, explain how they influence the returns and value creation processes, and how they impact the society and the planet. I believe that corporate reporting should be used to communicate not just how much money a company is making, but also how a company is making its money. So that's why accounting and corporate reporting rules are fundamental to get all businesses responsible and involved in solving the world's most pressing problems.
And zooming in on corporate reporting, because they are incorporating an ever-growing amount of information, corporate reports are becoming longer and longer. Do you believe that investors and analysts actually pay attention to the so-called ESG information or information about environmental, social, and corporate governance standards?
You are touching upon a very important point because on the one hand, regulators have been criticized for failing to mandate sufficient disclosure regarding firms' non-financial and ESG dimensions. On the other hand, investors and financial analysts denounce the perceived information overload. In this respect, I would like to mention a recent initiative that is the integrated reporting movement. An integrated report combines in one single document both financial and non-financial ESG disclosures. And this approach represents a relevant shift from other reporting practices, which generally involve the production of financial statements and standalone sustainability reports. And according to IR proponents, having separate reports makes the connection between the different dimensions of performance difficult to understand for investors and for stakeholders. Moreover, a specific guiding principle of the International Framework for Integrated Reporting is conciseness, which has been used by IR advocates to assert that this approach will assist in reducing the reporting burden for organizations, as well as in avoiding information overload for investors and other stakeholders. And this emphasis on conciseness is really an innovative element, and this new reporting approach is growing in importance around the world because companies see the adoption of an IR as an opportunity for greater alignment with the existing regulatory trends. But you need to know that it was first implemented in South Africa, where integrated reporting has been mandatory since 2010 for listed companies, according to an apply or explain approach. And I've been researching the IR setting in several studies. And David, going back to the core of your question, do investors find ESG disclosures useful? Well, I have two answers based on my research. The first one is that investors do incorporate ESG information in their decision-making processes. In one paper, we use a machine learning technique to identify the contents of financial and ESG disclosures, and then we evaluate the market effects. So basically how market participants react to these concepts. And our evidence suggests that when companies talk ESG, speak ESG, investors do listen. And they like some specific ESG topics, mainly linked to the governance dimension, as shown by the related positive market effects that we find in terms of firm value and stock liquidity. Our analysis suggests a growing emphasis also on the S, on the social dimension, by reporters. But the results on this topic are less well defined in terms of investor response. We also noticed that there is not much room in companies' disclosure for environmental topics, but I should say that our preliminary analysis include 6 years after the integrated reporting was mandated in South Africa. So we are working now on an extension of our time frame of reference to more recent years, and we expect and hope to find meaningful results on this aspect as well as on the social one, given also the impact of COVID. Second answer or point I would like to make to answer your question is that in any case, investors, market participants in general, appreciate reports that are short, focused, and readable. And in another paper, drawing on text analysis, we find that IR conciseness, so integrated reporting conciseness, is linked with higher stock liquidity, and IR readability is associated with a higher market valuation. So the general takeaway for companies, I would say, is that their ESG disclosures can definitely be value enhancing, but it's important to understand that not only what you disclose, but also how you disclose it matters for investors.
Critics say that while the movement towards voluntary corporate disclosure might have increased the quantity of available information, it has not necessarily increased the quality of that information. In one of your studies, you observe that even the most responsible companies in their corporate reports try to divert attention from their weaknesses. How do they accomplish this exactly?
Well, let me start by saying that while financial statements are subject to rigorous standards, non-financial ESG disclosures that are mainly voluntary, and especially the narrative parts, leave room for discretion, which also may mean concealments, omissions, and obfuscation, so low quality of the information provided. And particularly, ESG disclosures can be designed and customized to manage public impressions. When we talk about impression management in accounting, we refer to reporting bias that is introduced by managers who opportunistically select a style of presentation and report contents that are beneficial to their companies. This basically assumes deliberate managerial disclosure strategies, including, for example, what is called greenwashing. In the study you mentioned, together with my co-authors, we examined a sample of early adopters of integrated reporting that were involved in the pilot program. And our findings show that in the presence of a firm's weak financial performance, the integrated reports tend to be significantly longer, less readable, and with an overly optimistic tone. And interestingly, they are also more complete in terms of information about non-financial performance, possibly signaling a disclosure strategy that is aimed at redirecting the attention from hard financial numbers to other aspects of their performance. Also, firms with worse social performance adopt impression management strategies. And in this case, reports are foggier and less complete for what concerns ESG information. So to answer your questions, depending on the strength of the financial and non-financial performance, corporate managers and firms bias disclosures through obfuscation strategies, leveraging on different combinations. On the one side of quantity and content manipulation, so they shape the amount of disclosure and the scope of disclosure. And on the other side of syntactical reading is and verbal tone manipulation. So they kind of manipulate the style of the disclosure. Let me just add a quick comment, if I may, David, that goes back to my initial point about the lack of common and clear standards for ESG disclosures, which leaves, of course, more room to discretion and variation in disclosure quality.
You've mentioned greenwashing, which refers to companies who only pay lip service to the environment without actually doing much to help it. Recently, you have used the term COVID washing. Could you explain that?
Sure. I've used this term in a recent working paper about corporate resilience during crisis. and the role of sustainability, risk management, and of course, COVID washing, where I refer with my co-authors to the specific disclosure strategies aimed at manipulating the judgment of shareholders and stakeholders in general during the COVID pandemic and in the recovery period. You might know that greenwashing is defined as symbolic information that is provided by an organization without substantive actions. Mm-hmm. And similarly, we identify COVID washing as positive information about a firm's COVID response without the firm taking the corresponding actions, and as bad news disclosures presented in a positive tone. That is, when disclosures use a verbal tone manipulation strategy to obfuscate contents.
It sounds like the impression managers have had their hands in that.
Exactly, definitely.
What did your study conclude?
So we use, again, textual analysis, and we investigate a global sample of COVID-related disclosures, and we find that COVID washing positively affected the performance of companies during the crisis, performance measured in terms of abnormal market returns. And basically, the COVID crisis represents a setting whereby a company's disclosure about COVID and the related initiatives is more likely to be perceived as a credible commitment rather than cheap talk. And our results from multivariate regression analysis also show that firms with more advanced risk management systems handled the crisis better, which was kind of expected. And the top ESG performance fare better during the crisis. So ESG performance positively affects firms' abnormal returns during a crisis, and particularly in a non-US setting. Non-US firms that perform well, especially in the environmental and social pillars, have had higher cumulative abnormal returns during the crisis period. On the contrary, for US firms, there is no significant effect of ESG performance on firms' market performance.
I've got to say you're surprising me and shedding new light on just who accountants are and exactly what they do. I've always assumed that when people think of accounting, like me, they primarily think of accounts, numbers, and bookkeeping. But you're talking about information and textual analysis. Tell me more about the methods you use in your research.
Luckily, accounting is much more than bookkeeping. So the methods I use in my research, they are based on textual analysis. I mentioned that several times. This is a growing stream of accounting literature examining narrative disclosure. So basically the unstructured textual information that is presented by companies in addition to numbers. And this body of research has grown thanks to the increased electronic availability of corporate documents and to the improvement of the analytical tools that can be used to investigate textual information. We were once limited in our research by the need of manually coding data. But now we can leverage on the developments of computational linguistics and statistics for data reduction that is used to aggregate information included in large text into manageable indexes. And the most important advantages of using computer programs for our analysis, besides efficiencies, are related to the fact that the rules for coding text are made explicit. Therefore, these tools generate results that are formally comparable and allow the accumulation of research findings. And in my studies, by means of a dictionary approach, I have analyzed the lexical characteristics of corporate reports using disclosure indexes to study features such as readability and tone, so whether the language of the disclosure is biased towards optimism and certainty, and this is to infer disclosure quality. In some more recent working papers, to identify the most material thematic contents of integrated financial and ESG disclosures, we have used a machine learning technique that is called latent direct allocation, LDA. It belongs, in a wider sense, to the artificial intelligence toolbox. And its underlying idea is that observations are words into documents. And LDA posits that documents are a mixture of a certain number of topics, and that each word's presence can be attributed to one of the topics. And LDA accuracy in topic classification is close to human swan. It's basically a topic modeling algorithm that, let me simplify this, tells you what thousands and thousands of documents are about without you having to read them all. So it's a great thing.
Speaking of these various tools, how are accounting practitioners facing the spread of digital technologies?
Digital technologies are critically impacting accounting professionals who are becoming, and this is another surprise for you, David, digital accountants. Knowledge of new digital approaches for business, funding, payments, and services such as blockchain-based applications will be fundamental for all accounting and finance professionals. Big data, the use of artificial intelligence-based business analytics will enable more and almost real-time reporting, will enable predictive analysis, and will highlight clearly the connectivity of financial and non-financial performance. In addition, greater use of social media, images and videos will change and is changing corporate disclosure and reporting, and will impact on stakeholder engagement. And on this last point, I'm working on a research project you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation, a research project funded by IMA, the Institute of Management Accountants in US, where together with a colleague from the University of Manchester, Paolo Quattrone, I argue that digital technologies will transform the work of accountants and finance professionals because such technologies are transforming the way in which stakeholders interact with companies. We are envisaging that IT developments, together with the growing concerns about sustainability and resilience of businesses, will imply the progressive dismantling of a reporting model where corporations univocally define what value is and how to measure it by pushing information out to stakeholders, to one where it is the various stakeholders who express different notions of value and sustainability and pull information from diverse sources beyond the traditional corporate reports. Social media, including Facebook and Twitter, reveal more data than any traditional corporate report. And stakeholders will use tools to interpret big data and form their own judgments about the sustainability of a company beyond what is communicated through the traditional and more formal channels of reporting. These changes represent a challenge for accounting professionals and the finance function, but also a great opportunity.
What you were saying about digital accountants, since COVID, it's been so long since I've seen my accountant face to face. He could, in fact, be purely digital.
Definitely, it's a modern accountant.
Yes. But joking aside, is there any fear among accounting professionals that the shift towards non-financial metrics could make the expertise of other professionals more relevant than theirs?
I believe that sustainability and this new emphasis on non-financial aspects present some key challenges, you're right, but also opportunities for accountants. And the accounting profession has always help to support businesses and organizations in general and economies. And to continue to add value, professional accountants must be able to meet current needs and anticipate also emerging demands. One of them concerns the development of ESG disclosure rules that so far has taken place in a largely unstructured way and has resulted in a wide range of principles and frameworks appearing sometimes in competition. I mentioned before some initiatives aimed at providing global standards for sustainability in non-financial reporting. Accounting and finance professionals have a huge experience when it comes to defining reporting standards, and they will be definitely central in this process. Progress towards a generally accepted framework for sustainability accounting and reporting will involve collaborating with other experts and providing more specific guidance, of course, where necessary. So this is at the macro level. At the micro level, within companies and organizations, accountants have a role that will extend beyond performance measurement and reporting to contribute to decision making, to crafting clear corporate policies to address ESG issues, to managing the associated business risks, to protect corporate reputation, to engage in stakeholders and understanding their potential influence on company value. Last but not least, credibility of information about sustainability is a key aspect and can be strengthened by assurance. And also in this respect, accountants have a potential role to play. An assurance statement is a document that is provided by a competent third party that draws an independent conclusion on whether a sustainability report contains reliable information. And the need for assurance services is nowadays evident. And in my opinion, is likely to be filled by other professionals if the accounting profession does not rise to the challenge. But I have one interesting finding about this that is related to one of my studies, where we observe that investors attach value to assurance, which acts as a credibility-enhancing mechanism of non-financial disclosures. And interestingly, in one of our additional tests, we showed that the type of assurance provider matters. And our test suggests that those providers who belong to the accounting profession exert a stronger credibility signal towards capital market players.
Ariela, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks a lot, David. It was my pleasure.
I'm David Wayne Callahan, and this has been Clarity in a Messy World, a podcast from Bocconi University, Milan. Thanks for listening. You can find references from this episode in the podcast notes. And to be notified when new episodes come up, subscribe to Clarity on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Spreaker.